is a nested resource that allows you to fetch one campaign resource and then access the members for that campaign. Now, if I translate this to my Patreon page is one campaign, and anyone who is a member of my Patreon community will belong to the members resource. This is what the resource representation looks like, and you can see that this API endpoint supports cursor pagination, represented by the next cursor here, and the limit value in the total property. Then there's the API endpoint to fetch a single member, and you can see that this is now a top level API endpoint. It's not nested under the campaigns resource, so the Patreon API is trying to avoid deeply nested URIs. Moving on, we're going to see the next endpoint, which allows us to fetch the posts for a given campaign. These are the posts on my Patreon page, for example, and then again trying to avoid nested endpoints and exposing a top level endpoint to fetch a single post resource. Then we have the webhooks endpoints, and this allows you to introduce a subscription where you can specify a URL where you want to be notified when something of interest happens in the Patreon system. We discussed this in the webhooks lesson, and this is what a practical implementation looks like. There is a get endpoint to fetch the webhooks for the current user's campaign. There's a post endpoint that allows you to create a webhook, and then there's documentation about the webhook triggers. So for example, when a member is created, you can get a webhook request. When a member is updated, you can get a webhook request. When a member is deleted, when a member creates a pledge, updates it, deletes it, when a post is published, updated, or deleted. So these are the events supported for our webhooks. And when we have respective subscriptions and one of these events happens, Patreon is going to send a webhook request to our webhook URL, and then we can react to this response. Then you will see documentation about the webhook responses. It's a fairly complex object. There's a patch endpoint that allows you to partially update a webhook. So at this point, after examining all of the API endpoints, we can come to a conclusion that the Patreon API is a level 3 API in the Richardson maturity model because it's using resources and resource URIs. It's also using the proper HTTP methods and status codes inside of our responses, and it's also using hypermedia by returning hypermedia links in the API responses, which the client can use to send further API requests. Now moving on, we have the description for all of the resources. I'm going to quickly move over this part because I don't want us to look at each possible resource, and once we go over the version 2 resources, we are greeted with the version 1 API documentation. You can see that there is no version present in the base address of the API, and the resource representations are slightly different. In the version 1 of the API, they were using a flat JSON structure with the attributes of the current resource and then a relationships property for any related resources. They were only exposing 3 resources: the user, the campaign, and the pledge. And then we can see the API endpoints that were exposed here, an example of how we should authorize with this API endpoint, some example responses. You can also see that the version 1 API is using hypermedia, and then we have a couple more API endpoints. Now I want to move into the next part, which is still specific to the version 1 API, but it documents how to approach data shaping, included properties, then how to approach pagination and sorting. And finally, there is documentation about webhooks, and you can see that they are still maintaining the version 1 documentation, even though this version is no longer maintained and new clients should be using the version 2 API. And with this, we've reached the end of the Patreon API documentation. Now let's do a brief recap. So the functionality exposed by this API allows someone to create an integration with Patreon, and using this REST API exposes a couple of resources. The most important resources are the campaigns, the members, and the posts. And we also have a webhooks resource that allows us to asynchronously react to events inside of the Patreon system. Now, as I said, this is a level 3 API. According to the Richardson maturity scale, it supports resources and uniquely identifying them. It's using the correct HTTP methods and status codes for the API endpoints, and it's also using hypermedia in the API responses. When it comes to versioning the API, they are using URL versioning, and you can see that the version 2 API surface is completely different from the version 1 API surface. This constitutes a significant breaking change, which is why they decided to go for URL versioning. The new API surface isn't backwards compatible, so this is a disadvantage because they now have to maintain both the version 1 and the version 2 API. Something that's not explicitly communicated is when the version API will become deprecated, and no longer available. We also saw support for cursor pagination, rate limiting with different policies based on the client that is being used to authenticate with the API, and the specific access token that is being used in an API request. So you can see how this is a granular approach to defining the rate limiting policies. Overall, the Patreon API is a well-implemented REST API. It exposes some very high-quality documentation explaining how to integrate with the API, and it nicely describes how to approach the OAuth authentication flow to obtain the access token. I hope that you enjoyed this case study of the Patreon REST API and how it compares to the pragmatic REST API that we were building as part of this course. Until next time, stay awesome.